Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Good afternoon and happy Sunday. Today is August 2nd, 2020. I'm your host, Chad Dion Lassiter of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm really excited today as we have an amazing guest. Her name is Angela McIver. She's the Chief Executive Director of Fair Housing Rights Center in Southeastern Pennsylvania. But she's not just relegated to the state of Pennsylvania. She is a staunch advocate for equal rights in housing and fair housing, and just justice in general all over the United States of America. I certainly can spend time going into her bio, but you're going to hear from her as our topical area this afternoon is looking at redlining. Angela, welcome to PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. How are you this afternoon?
I am fine. Thank you so much, Executive Director Chad Lassiter. I'm very appreciative for this opportunity to join you this afternoon for this show, and I'm eager to talk about fair housing.
Great. And that leads me into the very first question. For our viewing audience, what is redlining and how did the term originate?
Well, redlining is a term that really came out of the 1930s during the Roosevelt administration. You have to think back to context. What was happening during that time frame? That was right out of the stock market crash of 1929. And our government was trying to save homeowners from going underwater in their mortgages, those who needed to be refinanced. So as a result of that, the Federal Housing Administration was created. But in addition to that, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which came out of the Home Loan Act of 1933, started creating maps all around our country. And there was a grading system that was built within the map because, of course, you had to understand what you were looking at. Mm-hmm. And the grading system went from A to D, A being best, obviously, and D being worst. But then there were also this coloration that was added to the grading system. So red indicated a few things. On certain maps, it meant dangerous. It could also mean risky. It could mean hazardous. And unfortunately, that is exactly where African Americans were relegated to live around the United States. So you know, as a historian, that the Great Migration was occurring, and as people were fleeing the South to get away from the brutality there, they wanted to go north in many instances, thinking that that was the land of new opportunity, only to be forced into certain communities where, in some instances, they couldn't even buy a home flat out because the redlining not only relegated them to the red shaded communities where things were dangerous, risky, and hazardous, but they also could not get a loan from the bank. So this redlining became pretty broad.
Wow. Can you expand a little bit more on some examples of redlining?
Sure. Redlining, again, is when other human beings determine that other human beings should live in certain areas. And those areas that they live in will not receive the same level of investment that you'll get outside of those red areas. And Chad, what's really unfortunate is that what we find in the redlining map, and if you don't mind, I'd like to hold an example of one up. This is the actual map of Philadelphia. I want to point to this section of the map.
Okay.
I want to draw everybody's attention to this section because when I hold this map up to this map of Philadelphia, and if I could overlay it for you, the same section that pairs up on this side with this side is suffering to this day.
Wow.
Yes. The lack of investment in the same area is prominent to this day. And I did some research recently and found out that when you look at social media, what is online about communities? So words like most ghettoized, most hazardous, highest in crime is associated with the same area that matches this redlining map.
Wow. Yeah.
To this day. And people in that area are not able to get the same amount of money for their home if they want to sell their home. Mm-hmm. And people certainly want to buy up the neighborhood, because once they buy it up, then they transform the neighborhood for people who can afford the new prices. But the people who are currently living there, who might want to look at their options and move on to other communities or just do whatever with their lives, are not able to get the same return for their dollar that folks can who are going to move into the area, because the land right now is considered cheap.
Wow. Now, that's powerful. And I hope our viewing audience looks at everything that you just verbalized in totality, because that leads me to my next question, which is, how is redlining still hurting minorities today? That aspect of who's going to get the loan, the practices of institutional racism, which you and I know is prejudice plus power, the impact that redlining at this very moment is having on minorities. Can you speak a little bit more to that as well?
Sure. It has a strong hold on people in many ways. So we can talk about the economic effects. We could talk about the social effects, the psychological, and even the physical. And I'm willing to take it a step further and say the spiritual hold that it has on people. Well, I'll start there. One of the reasons why John Lewis means so much to me is because John, like many other people, believed in the work. John was uncompromising about his belief.
He certainly was.
He was a human being, and that we're all members of the human family. And as a result of that, we deserve to be treated with dignity. Like John, I believe that it's not only my civil right and my human right, but it is my divine right, which supersedes all of the things that happen here on earth. As a divine spirit, I deserve to live with dignity.
That's right.
And I deserve to treat myself that way, and I deserve to be treated that way by others. And I also must do that with other people. So now let's talk about the economic effects.
Okay.
I just mentioned that if you're willing to sell your home, if you're living in, let's say, these redline areas and the legacy areas from redlining to this day, then you're not able to benefit economically from the sale of your home at the same rate of somebody who might be in a neighboring community that's already been gentrified, in which the homes are now going for, and I'm not making this up, and the 19132 zip code, I was able to look at what those homes were going for on average, and they're somewhere around $48,000 compared to the 31 zip code. And okay, those homes are now being sold for $258,000.
Wow.
Yes. So, how do you, there's ways to explain that, because I get that we're in a capitalistic society, but you and I understand that the capitalism started with Black bodies and other bodies, and it's still there. The needle hasn't moved much. We haven't figured out.
People are profiting off of it right now as we speak. People
are profiting from it, and people have a right to make a profit, but your right to make a profit ends where my body begins.
That's right.
That's just one aspect of the economic condition. If we talk about social, I know that in a few minutes you want to talk about schools, but that is really important, because if schools are not being properly funded because jurisdictions decide to implement, ordinances like tax abatements. And in the case of Philadelphia, we have what I call an excessive tax abatement because it lasts for 10 years. I get the concept of an abatement. It's an incentive. You want to change the economic conditions, but for the fact that it can go on for 10 years, that's practically the entire length of a child's education.
It is.
So if we look at how long the 10-year tax abatement has been in effect, we can also study the number of children who've been harmed by that abatement and look at where they are right now. I believe that longitudinal and cross-sectional studies should have been done on students to see the effects that that 10-year tax abatement has had on their lives. And one of my favorite authors is Malcolm Gladwell, because, you know, he just writes about all sorts of very interesting things. And at the beginning of the chapter, you wonder, where on earth is this going? And by the time it ends, you feel so enhanced by the experience. And I believe that a guy like Malcolm Gladwell could tell this story better than anybody else right now or in the future. If we look at the physical effects from it, because of the exposure to the environment, it could be an environmentally hazardous place. It could very well be high crime and violence. That takes its toll on people's bodies. And, you know, the thing that gets me with all of this is all researchers know what I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm not saying anything revolutionary right now.
Yeah. But I think it's important for our viewing audience, because you're mapping out some things that sometimes people don't take in consideration, right? Because when we hear institutional racism, the moment we find ourselves in with COVID-19, as well as the anthology of police brutality and the killing of Black and brown bodies unarmed, or just in general, we can't underscore all of those really jewels that you just provided for us. The environmental racism, the economic injustice, the profiting off of Black bodies, the educational apartheid, the ghettoization of spaces. When you look at the whole aspect of what you said about John Lewis, you're absolutely right. When it wasn't just the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but you know, those beatings and the legislation and all of the work that he and multiple others put in, women as well, was really about creating a new bridge to reimagine America differently from the inheritance of the birth certificate that in theory mentioned, you know, freedom, justice, and equality for all, but in practice was 401 years of oppression of Black people. And so, you know, the psychological aspect, if you could just touch upon that, because you're right about the whole golden rule, but as our grandmothers and our mothers and our fathers and grandfathers and community would say, treat people the way you want to be treated. And I would just go a step further and say, also treat people the way you were not treated. Some of us were not treated well, so you don't want to treat people along those indices, but you're right about the divine aspect. See my humanity. We're all part of the human race. And then the economic aspect, and then the physical aspect. What's the psychological aspect that redlining can have on communities and all the other things, and how that intertwines?
You know, we could limit this to redlining, or we could take this around the globe and see how colonialism and other practices have had a strong hold around different parts of the globe, but we'll restrict it to redlining. So the psychological effects can show up in many different ways. Number one, people can indeed experience trauma. We know trauma is when you're going through something that feels like you're going to die.
Wow.
Yeah, it feels like you're going to die. Whatever the heck this thing is, in the moment, you don't see a way out of it. Now, you do get out of it, but then your brain now has been rewired. There's a new pathway that is inside of you because all of your internal systems had to respond in a different way. And that mark is there. The amygdala, the hippocampus, everything is different. And anytime you experience that trigger or something that remotely looks like that trigger, that's the first thing that's going to come up inside of you. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people, because of the 401 years that you mentioned of nonstop cruelty in public policy and social policy, just in day-to-day interaction. Some of it has been sweet, but you know what? If we were talking about the majority of sweet things, you and I wouldn't be doing the work that we do.
Absolutely.
We're talking about more cruelty than we're talking about the sweetness of life. So it has shown up in the form of trauma. It shows up in the form of toxic stress inside of people, which we know triggers the body into disease. We know that. Hypertension, diabetes, among other things that happen to the body, and then to the mind, that people are not at ease. They're not their best selves. And I want to speak also about grief that people encounter, because all of the loss that we've had in our society around housing, and right now the fear that many people live with, worrying about the end of the moratorium on housing. Whether you're a homeowner or a renter, where am I going to live in the next few months? Having that big question mark in front of people does not leave them as their optimal selves. Right now, people are in a completely different mindset, and we will see the medical effects of this for years to come, believe me.
Wow, wow. When we're looking at individuals, families, and communities, based on your fair housing advocacy work and all of the great things that you've done, share with our audience just what it means when a family is in an environment where the school is underfunded, there's depressed infrastructure. What does that look like for an individual? What does that look like for a family? And what does that look like for a community? Because you're not a person that just theorizes about this. You're a person that is implementing change. You're a person that is agitating on behalf of the human family. What does that look like? What does the whole aspect psychologically of just the underfunded schools, the depressed infrastructure, what does that look like for individuals, families, and communities?
So I'll start with the bigger picture. In terms of the bigger picture, we're all on lockdown. Some people might appear as though they're having a fantastic time, and they are to a degree because they're getting to enjoy some of the fruits of life by having access to economics and go on vacations and purchase things and just gain access to all sorts of things. But underlying that is not a happy person. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it takes a lot of effort to participate in all of this stuff that we're talking about right now. Even the people who go lobby our elected officials to ensure that these public policies get written in a slanted and skewed way, they're not fully happy people. And they too have been traumatized. And I wanted to get back to that. Something happened. There has been something that has been interrupted inside of that human being that can lead them to that course. Because people who are reformed, people who are transformed, they don't behave that way. Wow. In terms of the families that are going through this, the families are under a lot of pressure and they're stressed out. You know, and thank goodness that some have enough reserve, enough resilience. And when there's enough resiliency in a community, things that people can access like institutional practices or some of the cultural tools that they may have, then that helps them navigate this. But my question in that instance is, you know, to talk to people who want to maintain that condition and outside of it just being out of pure meanness, why? Like, why? I am wired in such a way that, yeah, I believe in optimal things. I get upset about what I see, what I do. People ask me, do you enjoy your work? It's like, no, I don't like discrimination. I like social justice.
Yeah.
But I believe in higher things and believe that we are called to do higher things. And I believe that even people who are right now engaging in low level, low energy work can change if they desire to.
Wow.
How does it affect the individual? Well, it just prevents the individual from aspiring to their best selves unless there is an intervention. There's one-on-one, there's mentoring, you know, there's even a course like this, reading a book, seeing a movie. That art is tremendous because art has a way of speaking to people, even music, in ways that sometimes just the, you know, spoken word doesn't. But yeah, I mean, there's this cascading effect that this negativity has on everyone. So, you know, of course, I'm not the first person to say that if you hold somebody down, you're also holding down yourself. It's true. And I believe that, you know, we all need to be liberated and we're being called to that moment right now. COVID and George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and a host of others, they're all calling us to that moment right now.
Wow. I want you to get back because you had put it there as a footnote around transforming the self, as well as just not engaging in evil from a policy standpoint and disadvantaging others. Flesh that out a little bit more for even me, because this is a teachable moment for me. You know, even though I'm the host, I love just being in your presence and just, you know, not just hearing your passion, but the common sense language of just what we should be doing. When you were touching upon, you know, politicians and policymakers, revisit that because you had put it there as a footnote and said that you were going to come back to it. You know, tackle that.
Okay, well, I'll say this much. Let's talk about the term racism for a moment. And, for the viewers, stay with me. Stay with me. What I find to be very interesting is that for the last few decades, whoever brings up race becomes the racist. And I see that as a form of reverse psychology. I get that. That's a defense mechanism. And it's also a ploy. We know that out of the Southern strategy came many interesting ways of diffusing the issue of race, confusing people. We have an entire set of racist language that came out of that period. And right now, just even labeling someone with that term, you can see that even though the act that you are accusing them of committing may align with the term, they'll tell you, I'm not that.
Yeah.
To me, that is the highest form of cognitive dissonance. And and I, on a lighter note, and pardon me for the laughter in part is my own defense mechanism because I don't want to cry. Yes. So, the conflicts, the internal conflicts that people experience when they're in this space doing work that results in these unintended consequences or exactly the intention that they wanted, which is to devastate other people's lives and maintain an advantage over someone else so that you can have the psychological edge, you can have the economic edge, the social edge, whatever that gain is that you're looking for, that you maintain that. But within, unless someone is completely destroyed internally, most people are looking to be good and want to be called good, because I find it very interesting that when the term racist comes up, people who, again, are committing acts that align with the term will tell you, I am not that. And I would beg them to go somewhere and examine that, meet with an impartial party to talk about why that doesn't seem to line up with the observer. Okay, I get that your narrative of yourself may be one thing, but the people who are observing your conduct see something else.
Wow. Well,
and that could be I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Well, that could be a policymaker, and it could be a policymaker of color who does not believe in this work like John Lewis, and who doesn't believe in this work like you believe in it and like I believe in it, and believe that we're called to do it for higher reasons, but then become instruments of someone else's will and enacts a law that has such a devastating effect against people of color. Again, people who are living in these legacy areas that started with these red line maps.
So then when we say housing is abundantly, readily available in one neighborhood and there's scarcity in another, and then some of our white counterparts may say, well, you're saying that redlining is institutional racism, but the person that's engaged in it at this particular juncture is an African American. To your point, that African American or that person of color could be doing the bidding on behalf of white supremacy. Or on behalf of white elites who engage in forms of institutional racism. Because for me, I've always been concerned with just that aspect. One neighborhood just has nothing but abundant housing, and then the other neighborhood has scarcity, and the neighborhood that has scarcity and the depressed infrastructure and sidewalks and pavements that are uneven are neighborhoods that Black and brown people are in. And, we're taxpayers too. And to your point, we're human beings too. Our young people, when they're at the recreation center or when they're in school, they want pure water to come out of their water fountains as well. And they deserve that. That's a human right. So when we're looking at this aspect of individuals who are coming into the space of fair housing, if you could speak to what are some of those characteristics that they should have. Prior guests have talked about having people who have expertise in ethnography, urban design, sociology, algorithms, being committed to social justice. But if you could speak to individuals who are saying, hey, I want to be a fair housing advocate, what advice would you give them?
Great question. And I agree with all the other people who came before me and their remarks. But I'll add to that you have to be open-minded. You have to be willing to learn. One of the greatest parts of this journey has been learning more about history. I was always someone who enjoyed history, but you can see, the connections. You can see how one dot connects to the other. And even when at the top of this conversation, when you asked about what is redlining, when you think back to 1865 up to 1932, 1933, and that 70-year period in between, so much happened there. Reconstruction, reclamation, Plessy versus Ferguson, World War I, the stock market. I mean, there was so much that took place that influenced the creation of those redlining maps, the South's relationship with the North. And I don't know, from my assessment, it seems like the North has always, in many ways, genuflect to the South to appease it, ensuring that you stay in the Union now. You don't try that, which did once before again. So,
yeah.
And I see that almost happening right now in the way that certain elected officials behave. But I just believe that you have to become a scholar to this work. And when it gets to you, because it will, you need to do some self-care, have a hobby, have some friends, whatever, makes you happy. For me, it's good food, great conversation, some art, downtime, do all of those things because this work is weighted. And connect with the good people in this space, and the negative people in this space, I'm going to ask you to please leave.
Wow. The unique thing, and I hope that on this beautiful Sunday afternoon that our viewing audience is really, really taking note of your humanity, because it's raw, it's real, it's organic, and it's authentic. Because we tend to think that all teachers are committed. We tend to think that, folk who are in the fight for justice, that it's not just theoretical, but they actually mean it. And you're right. There has to be a clarion call that if you're not committed to this work, but you're presently in systems to do this, that you are actually harming individuals. Teachers that don't see the value in their students, whether that's rural white students, whether that's, Native American, Indigenous, whether that's African American, whether that's transgender, stop teaching.
Yes.
Those who are in this space fighting for justice in multiple agencies, don't stay if you're not going to be committed to justice and social equity and fairness. And so that leads me to my next question, which is not necessarily, and maybe it is a call to action. How do we address redlining with policymakers, and what does that look like?
I believe we have to educate policymakers, but we also have to hold them to account. When they're going in the wrong direction, that's what our vote is all about. We can't continue to reward people for conduct that results in the destruction of life. And we're well aware of what that looks like now. What I find so interesting about our response to COVID is, we were immediately able to link up the health disparities with COVID to all the other social problems that have been going on for decades. And what I thought about as an advocate is, I hate to say it this way, but I told you so. And I not only told you so, but I told you so numerous times. And why weren't you listening to me? And then, I was reminded of, well, that's because, whether you're educating elected officials or you're lobbying with elected officials, it's about interest and it's about interest group. But, it really is a battle of decency versus destruction. And for those of them that want to destroy, you have to take ownership. And if I can tie what I'm saying to you right now to real life things that happen in fair housing, it is common for me to run into people who at the latter stage of their lives as seniors are now in need of the very services that I offer.
Wow.
Who admit, because we end up, developing a rapport with each other, that they never saw it coming when they were younger, that they did nothing when they were younger to make things better. This stuff and I'm not saying that just because you didn't, you'll suffer when you get older. That is not the point I'm making.
Okay.
But I'm trying to help people to see that life is circular. And that's for all of us. That is for all of us, So if you begrudge somebody of a basic need now, you don't know what predicament you'll be dealing with when you get older. So don't withhold it from people, because it's the same thing that you'll end up needing. Everybody is a member of at least one protected class. The issue with the Southern Strategy and the Civil Rights Acts is that the Southern strategists decided that they will undermine the act. Well, they're undermining themselves and they're undermining their own people. Not everybody's going to be a millionaire when they retire.
Wow. So before we conclude, what do you say to those who say, I don't have the language as it relates to understanding what redlining is, but they know that something is just not right. Something is awry. Something is just unsettling, whether it's in their spirit, whether it's psychological, whether it's the outcomes that they see. Young children who, when we're talking about hermeneutics, they might not understand that word, and some viewing audience might not understand it. It just means that you're going somewhere and you see a difference. You're driving in your neighborhood, you notice abandoned buildings, you notice decay. And not all minority communities or communities in general have all of these characteristics. But what do you say to those who are trying to find the language and they don't know that the language is redlining? How do we give them the language to interpret what they're seeing and what they're ultimately experiencing?
Mm-hmm. I would recommend reading different books. One example is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Another example is The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Don't be thrown by the word reparations. If that's a word that you struggle with, again, you have to be open-minded when we're learning. That's an important mindset to have. Also, Homewreckers, which is a recent book by Aaron Glantz. Of course, American Apartheid.
Doug Massey, yeah.
Massey and Dent, American Apartheid. One of the books that changed my life last summer that I read was The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. I never once gave consideration to the story of my own family's migration from the South to the North. But because Isabel is such a beautiful writer, she was able to take something that was difficult to deal with and turned it into a beautiful story about three people's experience. And then she wrapped the history around it. So that's a reading. And there are many other books. In fact, I'd be happy to provide a book list if that's something that you're interested in.
Yeah, certainly. If you can send that along, what we'll do is we'll make that readily available. What we say at the end of every show, people know that they can go to our website at www.phrc.pa.gov. And so, this list that you're mentioning, Isabella, I wasn't familiar with her book. But I see the joy and excitement that you get out of it. Before we end, when we look at the term or the phraseology, fair housing, what's one word for you that comes to mind?
Can I have two, please?
You can have two.
Thank you so much. So my first reaction is misunderstanding.
Okay.
Because people don't get the term. I really wish that at the beginning of this, another term would have been selected, because I think fair housing is, it's misleading. You talk about fair and then you attach it to housing. So I would think people think, oh, well, if it is fair, then it's housing. But that's the opposite of what it is. And then people do use it that way when it's a legal term that refers to discrimination. And it's not just any kind of discrimination, because there is lawful and then there's unlawful discrimination. So see why I don't like the term?
I got you.
Yes. But what I do like about it is the social justice that people are able to achieve if they know their rights. They're able to recognize that they've been discriminated against, and then they know their rights, file a complaint, and so forth. But doggone it, you got to go through a hardship in order to get there. So yeah, I struggle with all of that. It's more about just anti-discrimination in housing. And I'm not sure what that word is right now or term that we could have come up with or we can replace it with, but it's really anti-discrimination in housing.
Thank you. I want to thank you, Angela, for not only just being on our show this Sunday, but for your passion around justice, around equity. We're in a moment now where people want to talk about diversity and inclusion, but they don't want to have candid conversations around social justice and equity and what that looks like. When we talk about racial equity, that means that some of us may have to give something up, and that means that the power structure. So all over the globe, when people are talking about systemic and structural oppression, when they're talking about we have to dismantle white supremacy and institutional racism, well, are you willing not to be the CEO so that a qualified African-American woman could be the CEO? Are you willing to, step down so that a transgender Latinx person could be, the CEO? Are you willing to, provide policies that are speaking to boards being more representative of the community that you're recruiting to have people come to your schools? I just want to thank you because even in my role as the executive director of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, I didn't know anything about fair housing until I got to the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission and I met you and multiple others. And so you have been a mentor in this space for me. I think that before I end, it would be disingenuous as some leaders engage in thinking that they know everything. But I'm here on this Sunday publicly saying, I don't know all things, and none of us do. It's the peculiar arrogance. It's the peculiar arrogance of our democracy where there are those who want to pretend that they know everything. You have been a tutor and a mentor for me to kind of not only understand fair housing, but to just take it serious, that it impacts and it intersects with so many things. For our viewing audience, hopefully what you take away from this every first and third Sunday is that white racism disadvantages whites as well. But what occurs is that white elites seduce us into the black-white binary to not feel as though we're all intertwined. The moment that we find ourselves in has whites and others on every side of the color line and gender line standing up for Black humanity in this moment, not a dismissing of other forms of occurrences or any other humanity. It's just saying at this particular time, this is what we need to focus on. So I want to thank you. I want to thank those of you who have tuned in on this Sunday for some high level and some practical information on redlining. Thank you for joining us here at PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.